You're listening to Mark of the Maker. Hey everybody, I'm Mark Steiner and you're listening to Mark of the Maker. This is episode 70 of the show and we have a special guest with us to chat. Let's check in first, make sure we have everybody here. I think we got a full crew this week. We have Mr. Michael Birch.
Here.
And we have Mr. Tom Crine.
Hello, everyone.
And we have Mr. Sean Kendrick.
Hey, hey.
All right. So we have the band back together. We're going to do a little interview. This is some combination of interview and topical. I think it's probably more topical because this is a guest that joined us previously back in episode 63, and that is Dr. Laron Thomas.
Hey, back by popular demand. I am here. Emails won't stop.
The people can't get enough of me, he said.
Welcome back.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time. Yeah. So we talked with Laron about a couple different episode ideas, and this was kind of the obvious one to us that came up first. And I think the working title we're using here is Metallurgy Mythbusters. So this is going to be a whole list of things that people say or that you hear or... You know, the knife world is full of tribal knowledge, right? It seems like knife world, gun world, doesn't matter. They're full of tribal knowledge. And so sometimes the tribal knowledge is full of baloney and sometimes it's money. And we're going to talk about a bunch of different things that get said and get Laron's take on what they mean. So for folks who may not remember from episode 63, Laron, the name of the book is Knife Engineering.
Yep, Knife Engineering.
So Laron's got an excellent book out there, great reference that lots and lots of people have on their bookshelf or on their workbench and refer to on the regular. And so it's a great reference for everyone, and it's a cool book. Laron, where do they get the book at if they don't have it?
Yeah, Amazon is the easiest place usually. So,
okay,
yeah, go to Amazon, type in Knife Engineering, it'll come up right away.
All right. So before we get started and dive into this thing, we got a couple of people we need to thank. It's normal here that we try to hit our Patreon supporters. So the nice folks on Patreon send us a couple bucks each month, help keep the show rolling, and we greatly appreciate them. So high five to our Patreon folks. We did a Q&A episode here recently. They gave us some ideas for our Q&A episode along with our Facebook group, so that was really cool. And we were able to answer some questions for people. Sometimes we have merch stuff available early for Patreon folks and a couple other little benefits. Sometimes they get a little discount on stuff or whatever. So anyway, for folks that support us on Patreon, thank you very much. We appreciate you. For folks that don't follow or support us on Patreon, that's okay too. But if you'd like to, you can find us at patreon.com and just search for Mark of the Maker and you'll find us there. And you can help support the show. And Laron, you have a Patreon as well, right?
Yep, patreon.com/knifesteelnerds.
There you go. So high five to our Patreon folks. And Laron's, he's got a whole bunch of supporters, I think, on Patreon.
Yeah, Patreon is awesome. Just, allows me to do a whole bunch of things I wouldn't be able to afford to do. So my wife can't say no to the forge I just bought.
I'm glad to be a part of that, Laron. I am a supporter on Patreon.
There you go.
Thank you.
Tom's on board. Tom's on board the overrule Laron's wife on the money train.
No. Don't get me in trouble, Mark. I got plenty of that on my own.
I got enough problems, he said. All right, so I think Michael is going to give another thank you that we need to get out there.
Yeah, we need to thank George Pelagoni. He's sponsoring this show. You can get all your titanium, your zirconium, some damage steel, and all sorts of fun stuff at amxinc.com, amxinc.com.
Right on. So thanks, George. Thanks for your support of the show. George has been with us for a while now, and we appreciate you, buddy. Okay, so we got the business taken care of, and I think we're going to dive into this thing. So anything you want to say about this whole process we're about to go through, Laron, before we start? Any disclaimers you want to make? Do they write complaint department at knifesteelnerds.com or something if they disagree?
Yeah, you can always go to knifesteelnerds.com, click on the contact me button, and you can send me angry emails. You can go to my Instagram or my Patreon. I'm very easy to contact. So maybe some of these myths I'm wrong. Maybe they're not myths. Maybe they're true.
Oh,
So we can hash it out.
all right. Well, that'll be entertaining. I think I'm just going to make a prediction right up front. I think Tom Cryan is going to be the Arnold Horseshack in the room. And that only old people will understand what that means, but
I don't know who that is.
Really? Okay. Like I said, only old people know. Used to be a TV show called Welcome Back, Kotter, and there was a guy who was in class, and anytime a question would be asked, he was the guy who would always answer the question, so they try to pick somebody else, but he would like poke his hand in the air constantly and say, ooh, 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 wanting to jump in. So I predict Tom.
So you're throwing me under the bus, Mark.
No, I'm just saying. You're going to jump in and tell Laron he's wrong at some point. I can feel it happening.
I've gone to Laron for help. Why would I tell him he's wrong?
To be right.
That's right. That's why. I'm pretty sure you told him he was wrong at least one point in episode 63.
Oh, I did.
Well, okay. Let me rephrase. You told him you had to disagree.
Oh, maybe. I don't know.
Disagreement's okay.
That's been at least 2 weeks. I can't remember that far back.
Tom doesn't even know anymore.
I have limited memory storage, so I have to keep that purged. Like Michael said, who can remember like other kids' birthdays?
Yeah, exactly.
I have a hard enough time remembering my kids' birthdays.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hear that. Abby's got a good excuse for remembering my daughter's birthday. She knows it's an easy one to remember because it's the same day. That's just an easy thing. Like Luke Burnley's birthday. Do you know when Luke Burnley's birthday is?
No.
It's Mark's birthday. Same day.
Oh.
We're birthday twins.
Don't know when that is either.
I still don't know.
It was less than 2 weeks ago and you still don't remember.
2 weeks ago, 5 months ago.
It's like
It's
right
all in the
a day
past.
before Ben's, maybe? Is it the 12th?
It's the 14th.
Damn it, a day.
It was the day Birch suggested that I turned 68 that day.
Oh, yeah.
Now I remember, he said. Yeah, okay. All right, so you can find Laron through any communication channel and yell at him and tell him he's wrong. That would not be a first, right, Laron? That seems to be a normal part of your
Oh, yeah.
Knife Steel Nerds experience.
Yeah, people tell me I'm wrong every day.
At work, at home, it doesn't matter. I'm used to it. Okay, let's, and Laron, to be fair, generated almost the entirety of this list. So these may be some that he has experience trying to explain before, but let's dive into it. So first one, the first thing on the list is stated as, get ready to buzz in, Tom. Heat treating is the most important factor for high performance knives.
Oh, I know.
Yeah, that's a myth. It is not true.
Oh,
So this one evolved. So it started out where knife makers would say, if you have the highest end steel there is and you heat treat it badly, then you've got a bad knife. Then it got bigger and bigger of a story until people thought that heat treatment was the secret to all performance. And it's not true. So the steel choice matters. And more than either of those things, heat treating or steel, is the edge geometry. So if you've ever seen an episode of Forged in Fire, you know that you can heat treat steel very poorly and still do some impressive things because they get the right edge geometry on there. You know, if you got to do some tough chopping tasks, you got to have a beefy edge. It doesn't matter how well you heat treat it. It doesn't matter how tough your steel is. And if you want a fine cutting knife that cuts really well and cuts a long time, you need a thin geometry. So geometry is the number one factor for performance. But of course, in an ideal world, we would have all three of those factors selected specifically for the type of knife that we have. And that's steel, heat treatment, and the edge geometry.
Now, to be fair, Tom does have some weird analogy about a three-legged dog or something.
Three-legged stool, man.
Oh, yeah.
Three-legged stool.
oh man.
Yeah, it won't stand without all three. I mean, it kind of will, but not as well.
Yeah, lots of stools only have 3 legs, though. Shop stools have 3 legs sometimes.
Yeah, they do fine on 3 legs. Heat treat, geometry, and the steel.
Right. So, Laron, is there so edge geometry number one.
Mm-hmm.
Would you put steel selection and heat treat both as number two, tied for number two? Or would it depend again on what the knife is for?
Yeah, it's really hard to separate between those two because, again, this myth gets extended where they say it doesn't matter what steel you have. If you forge it and cycle it and heat treat it in the perfect way, then you can make a low wear-resistant steel cut forever. And it's just not the case. So, I mean, if you need a knife that'll slice forever, you need a high wear resistance steel. If you take 1095, it doesn't matter what you do to it. It's not going to slice as long as a steel with higher wear resistance.
There you go.
The converse also, though, is true. You can have M390, and if it's like not heat treated or heat treated extremely poorly, it's not going to do well either, even if the geometry is good.
Right.
So,
and if you've got a steel with a whole bunch of carbide in it, you can't get rid of those carbides. They're brittle particles. And even if you have the super ultra heat treatment, it's just not going to be as tough as a steel with a low amount of carbide. So in an ideal world, you want all three to be optimized for the given knife: the geometry, steel, and heat treatment.
Gotcha. They're all number one, aren't they, Laron? It's like your children.
I remember those.
They're all your favorite.
But, to be a little bit contrarian, and because I do feel strongly that geometry is the most important one, just saying that heat treatment is the most important thing drives me crazy. So.
Don't you also think it's true that, and this is my personal feeling, that the high-end steels they're like a tangible thing. So it seems like knife companies and everybody else, they don't really talk about their geometry or the heat treat. They talk about their steel because it's a tangible thing and, they can sell it.
Yeah, there's two major spec sheet items when it comes to knife performance. One is steel and one is Rockwell hardness. But even Rockwell hardness, they don't always include it on a spec sheet. Spyderco doesn't usually list hardness on most of their marketing materials. So yeah, a lot of it comes down to steel, and a lot of people equate steel with performance. So I want a high performance knife, so I get the knife in M390 or whatever the hot steel is.
And I think that's where the steel snob people come in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, Tom, if you're a marketing guy, like a branding guy, right? What are you going to say? We have really good edge geometry. Of course you do. That's what a knife is, right? Oh, we really got the heat treat right. Well, I sure hope so, right?
But a lot of people don't.
No, I know.
On both of those.
I know, but it's like, I think as a buyer, a typical buyer,
agree.
Obviously someone who's not in the Knife Steel Nerds Patreon, for example, looks at it and says, well, of course they nailed the heat treat. Of course they got the edge geometry right. They're a knife company. Right. So it's easy to latch on to the steel branding thing because, you get jazzy names for steel and like Magna Cut and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think there's sort of different tiers of understanding. So someone comes in and they're like, I want to buy a nicer knife. This knife is not doing it for me. And they start looking up knives and things and seeing all the specs. And they're like, I have no idea what any of this means. And so they start reading around and they learn about different steels, and they read an article on best steel, and it says M390 is the best steel. And that tells them that they're now a steel snob. So they say, okay, I need a knife in the best steel. I'm going to find one in this M390 I just learned about. Then they start going around forums or talking to dudes, and then they're like, oh, no, it's not about the steel. Come over here. The real secret is the heat treatment. Right. And they're like, oh, right. So the heat treat, I got to learn which company has the best heat treatment. That's the real secret. And then they spread that to all of their other snob friends, like the real secret is the heat treatment. Ignore the steel. It's about the heat treatment. But then, you learn some more and you realize, okay, the edge geometry, how I sharpen it, what the edge angle is, though that's going to control the performance even more than what I was told was the secret before. So, we might call it different levels of understanding. So it depends on what consumer you're talking about. The completely clueless guy, the one that's learned about steel, the one that's learned about heat treatment, or the one that's learned about edge geometry.
Well, it was so important there for a bit that people were putting the logo of who heat treated on their knives for a bit.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the Boss logo was still used, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I still got some little stencils.
There you go. You could be latching on, Tom, to level 2 enlightenment knife buyers.
I'm going to put my logo on the back because I'm heat treating myself now. It'll be double logoed.
Heat treat by
2,
Tom.
3.
Well, some
sure
knife
they
makers
dog.
do build a lot of their reputation on heat treatment. I mean, people like Ed Fowler or, of course, Bob Dozier is relevant in this conversation.
Diamond D2.
Oh,
Yeah.
Phil Hartsfield and A2.
Mm-hmm. So and I'm sure they have good heat treatments. I'm not disparaging them, but they have a good heat treatment, a good knife, and they themselves will push that they have superior heat treatment, or their fans will go out and spread the word, and that becomes part of the legend of the knife and the knife maker.
Yeah, good marketing.
Yeah. All right. I like it. It's a very interesting explanation, and maybe some folks actually learned something. That's a good thing.
That does kind of tie into our next question or myth.
Let it rip.
So the next one is, can a backyard bladesmith discover a new super heat treatment that can't be matched?
Yeah, and there are some modern guys that I could put into this category maybe, but I'm going to avoid talking about them. And we'll stick with someone who's dead.
How about Rick Tig?
Yeah, he's the best example, I think, and I have written about him before, and his legend is perhaps bigger than any other knife maker of modern times. He was on Ripley's Believe It or Not. So he would go from town to town and he would chop through like big steel bolts or axles and stuff like that, and then shave paper after, and that amazed everyone. And then there's an interview he did with a guy that was in one of the Knives annuals, I think. And the guy asked him, like, hey, are you going to pass down your heat treatment? And he said, no, I haven't found anyone who's deserving of the heat treatment. It's going to die with me.
Wow.
Something like that. Or maybe he was still planning on it. Anyway, it didn't get handed down to anybody. And then there are 2 journal articles where metallurgists attempted to recreate his heat treatment, and they were unable to do so. So even the metallurgists were having a hard time figuring it out. So yeah, the legend is really great. One of the journal articles, they proposed that he had discovered how to heat treat for bainite before it was discovered by metallurgists. And they said maybe he was doing it with lead pots or something.
Yeah, I read that one.
Yeah, so I did a write-up. I own a Rich Tig knife, though I can't claim that I analyzed it. And I mean, I did check for hardness, and if there's one thing everyone can agree on, it's that the hardness of Rich Tig knives was all over the place. Mine was in the high 50s. Then in the journal article, they tested one that I think was in the high 40s or low 50s Rockwell, and the other was in the mid 50s. So his heat treatment seemed to be inconsistent, and they also pulled out a tensile bar, it's called, out of the bigger knife that was at lower hardness. And a tensile bar is just like a little rectangle that they cut out scoops out of the side so it looks like a dog bone. They pull it to failure. They see how much stress did it take until it broke and how far did it stretch before it broke. And they said the tensile properties in terms of how far it could stretch, the ductility was really good. And they showed some micrographs, but the softer knife and the harder knife had a different microstructure. And when I looked at the microstructure, there were some elements in there that they did not discuss. There was some evidence of perlite or ferrite in the microstructure, which would indicate that he either underheated the knife or didn't cool it fast enough, which might make sense given that it was a larger knife. So he either didn't soak it long enough because he's used to lots of like boning knives and other thin knives, or the cooling medium, the quenching he was using, was not fast enough for that heavier cross section. And then in the future, in the second article, they tried to recreate the heat treatment that led to the properties in that softer knife that they were able to test in tensile testing. And it has high ductility because it had the perlite and ferrite in it. So just, you're not supposed to heat treat knives in that way. It makes them too soft, and it also reduces toughness. And then
Okay.
also in the original study, we're probably going too detailed on Rich Tick here, but
No, it's all good. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
so in the original study where they showed that tensile test, they also compared it to a series of heat treatments that were done on 52100, including bainite heat treatments of 52100. And at least one of the conditions of the 52100 was both stronger and more ductile than the corresponding Rich Tick knife in 1095. So, I mean, in the original comparison they did, they found that the 52100 with a bainite heat treatment could be superior. So by their own tests, it was not an extraordinary result.
Interesting.
But more generically, I mean, metallurgists have tested, thousands, unlimited number of different heat treating techniques and methods, and the legend of a random knife maker who comes upon a new amazing way that the metallurgist can't figure out is just unrealistic. So, I mean, we can talk about good heat treatments, great heat treatments, even amazing heat treatments, but to come up with something new or super incredible that can't be matched, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
One thing I like about your
What about explosion?
Say that again, Michael.
What about explosion? Wasn't that one back in the day?
Explosion heat treating?
Yep.
Not familiar with that one.
It was like explosive
Yeah, I think I remember.
bonding. I don't know who the fellow is. He's probably not around anymore, but it was an interesting ad there for a long time. Something about you can only bond the molecules, quote unquote, there.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a good one.
Were you going to add something, Tom?
Well, I was just going to say, if you haven't checked out Laron's site, it's really interesting, especially this article on RickTig. And it's got a really cool historical picture. And I don't know if you've ever really checked that out close. They show the same picture drawn out for Ripley's Believe It or Not. And in the drawing, he's got 4 fingers, but if you look at the photo, he's only got 3. So something happened. Kind of interesting there.
Wow.
But I love that article. What about, here's something that's not really heat treating, but do you remember like I forget what it was called. They took D2 and they would like mill the edge on a CNC with like a dull tool or something.
Yeah, that was diamond blade. Someone mentioned that earlier. The method is called friction stir welding, but because they're not welding anything, they call it friction stir processing. So I also have an article on that. It's an interesting method. I ultimately concluded I wasn't sure how much of an improvement they were actually getting. The biggest proposed improvement was basically in grain size. So you could get a grain refinement just because it would heat it up and cool it down very rapidly. And their hardness numbers were high, not unreachable, but maybe half a point or a point harder than you could get with conventional heat treating. So that may have indicated they were indeed getting a grain refinement.
It was kind of interesting.
But in terms of the carbide structure refinement, like using CPM D2 would be more effective than using friction stir processing on conventional D2. So yeah, that one's a very interesting one. I don't think you should dismiss it as useless or maybe it's hyped up, but it is an interesting technique for heat treating.
What exactly is the technique? I didn't catch what Tom said about how they do it.
Yeah, so Tom's explanation was good. They just have like a rotating tool, and it kind of plunges into the steel and then moves along, and it rapidly heats and kind of stirs the steel as it passes by. And so it rapidly heats it, deforms it, and then it cools very rapidly after that.
Is this a surface treatment on a bar of steel, or this is when it's still being, I don't know, poured or processed, the steel itself?
No, they have a solid sheet of steel. They just buy D2 off the shelf, basically. And then in the videos and the pictures, they've got 2 knives touching point to point, and they have the tool start near the tang of one and go up to the tip and then go back down the other side. That's a little hard to describe using words. But Yeah, and then they cut it out, and so I think they do some tempering after also. Yeah, so it's interesting. I don't know, that started like 15 or 20 years ago or something.
So this isn't like just a work hardening process on the surface. It actually generates enough heat that it does something with the bar itself or with the blank itself. Or with the blade.
They're austenitizing and quenching.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. I don't think I ever heard of that before.
Yeah, there was a little bit of funny stuff. Like they did a Catra test, but they didn't do a normal Catra test. They were like doing some cutting and then stopping and testing sharpness or something. I forget. The details are in my article on it.
Okay.
So that told me that the normal Catra test didn't show what they wanted, and so they came up with a different version, which did show an improvement apparently. So
yeah. I've absolutely seen that happen before. Oh, that test didn't give us what we want. Let's run a different test.
Exactly. Very smart.
Right. Crafty even.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Anything else on that one? I think we hit the Richtig thing pretty hard, but that is really good. I'm definitely going to go read that article. I don't think I've read it at your site. Okay. Sounds like Birch is in as well. All right. What, Michael, you want to hit the next one, number 3?
Yeah, so heat treatments and data sheets are designed for industry and don't apply to knives. Definitely seen that before.
Yeah, this is another good one. And some guys known for being smart in terms of metallurgy and heat treating for knife makers will make this claim. And I think it's a little bit misleading. Yes, in industry, their goals can be somewhat different than making a knife. But if you take a so-called industry data sheet or heat treatment and you follow it to the letter, it will make a good knife, a better knife than many other knife makers, I promise. And so sometimes people talk about industry heat treatments as if they're just completely in a different realm that couldn't even apply to knives, or just that, their goal is this and our goal is this and they're not compatible. And it's not really true. So usually when metallurgists are designing a data sheet, they're trying to make a generic heat treatment that will apply in a lot of scenarios, big parts, little parts. That's another thing people will say about industry and scare quotes, is that they all make these huge parts and they never make anything small, and knives are small. But no, they make data sheets for a whole range of different types of parts. And it's got to work with small parts and large parts. And so, yes, it can be more generic than is required for a knife. Maybe if they were only designing a heat treatment for a knife, it would look a little bit different. But there's not so many areas for optimization as is sometimes emphasized by certain knife makers.
Interesting. So the statement as such, misleading is a great way to say it, I think, right? Maybe exaggerating or overstating a little.
So
yeah.
The biggest change you would say is the hold times for us?
Well, even hold times, knife makers are afraid to hold things at temperature. They think that you're just going to lead to super rapid grain growth or something. But in most cases, if you're austenitizing, for example, at the correct temperature, you can hold it there a lot longer than necessary, and the grain growth will be minimal. Because you have carbides and things which are pinning those grain boundaries. And until you dissolve more of those, the grain growth is going to be very slow. Now, if you overheat the steel, grain growth can happen very quickly, but temperature is more important than time. So, yeah, if I have had this accusation thrown at me even by people that wanted to say that my studies were meaningless. Is in my Catra study, I remember a guy was like, those heat treatments are all garbage you did on those knives for the edge retention testing. And I'm like, okay, give me an example. Like, we can talk about, whether it made a difference, or we can test something else. And he wouldn't give any examples. He just wanted to say that it was all bad. And then eventually he said hold time was off. So yeah, some knife makers are like 5 minutes and no longer, or 10 minutes or no longer. And adding a few extra minutes is not going to be a big deal. And as one counter example, we did a study on toughness of 8670, and we did 5 minute, 10 minute, and 15 minute hold times at the austenitizing temperature. And the 5 minute hold times led to lower hardness and lower toughness than the 10 minute holds. And the 15 minute hold was basically identical to the 10 minute. So I'd say under austenitizing is a bigger potential danger than over austenitizing in terms of hold time. So yeah, that's a good one to bring up. Is hold time is a common boogeyman, but it really doesn't come up in most cases.
I just had this conversation like 2 weeks ago with somebody, but that's odd. They were like, "You can't hold it past 10 minutes." I'm like, "Yeah, you can.
Yeah,
you absolutely can." Like,
yeah,
no,
and there's countless journal articles out there where they'll hold stuff for 30 minutes or 60 minutes. I mean, from PhD metallurgy research projects.
Yeah. Well, I tried to explain that your heat oven or whatever may not be holding your temp that long, but if the temp is staying the same, you can. But,
Yeah, and also things level out. You know, in the initial stages, things are changing very rapidly, and then it's changing less and less as you go out to more time. So, you know, the difference between 1 minute and 5 minutes is huge. The difference between 10 minutes and 15 minutes is very small. You know what I mean?
Right. It's not a linear thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, do you find like a lot of this has to do with sort of a slingshot effect of we overcorrect like one way or the other way when it comes to some of these myths, like the hold times and the fact that, you know, heat treat is the most important sort of thing?
Yeah. Yeah, I think exactly. So, you know, they probably start out from a good place. You know, someone is arguing against you or your heat treatment. Like, you go to a hammer and someone teaches you how to heat treat 1084, and they're like, "I'm looking at this data sheet from the ASM heat treaters guide, and it says to hold at 1500, and you said 1475. And so they say, "Well, you know, that's the industry heat treat. Mine is more optimized for this knife." And they're like, "Oh, okay, you know, that makes sense." And then the story gets bigger from there, and until they reach a point where they're saying, "Just throw away the industry data sheet because we got to heat treat knives, not tools," or, you know, whatever they're saying.
Yeah.
Well, and maybe same thing may be true with the hold time stuff, right? Like you said, when you're in that front loaded portion of the curve, okay, 1 minute to 5 minutes, the only difference is only 4 minutes, right? So yeah, you have to get to a certain spot, but maybe once you get past that spot, then, you know what I mean? If the change is minimal, then yeah, hold time is really critical, but as long as you get to to where you need to be, you can hold it longer and it's not as much of an impact. You know what I mean? That same kind of idea where maybe it's rooted in something that does make sense, but there's more to the story.
Yeah, and sometimes I think it makes sense to think in the opposite direction. You know, their concern is, let's play it safe, let's go a little shorter. And I'm like, let's play it safe, let's go a little longer.
Right.
And if you're doing a range of different knives, you know, like you've got these heavy Bowie knives versus thin little folder knives, you can austenitize them all for the same amount of time if you just have the right hold time. Where if you're trying to dial in exactly 5 or 6 minutes on the thin folder and then you go to do your thick Bowie, then you've got a rich tick situation where he didn't know how to harden those.
Yeah. Okay. They're thinking, sometimes people might be thinking about that knee in the curve being on the wrong side of their time reference or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. So don't throw out the industry standard heat treat info. But
yeah, I would start there unless you've got a good reason to do something else. You know, in a lot of studies we've done for Knife Steel Nerds, we've tested against conventional wisdom from knife makers and ended up proving the data sheet right by accident. You know, sometimes even surprising myself. In other cases, there are times where conventional wisdom among knife makers did lead to a more optimal result in terms of hardness or toughness. So I wouldn't say it never happens, but in general, the industry heat treatment was created the way it is for a reason, and that's because it solved a number of issues.
Yeah. So for a product like Magna Cut, where it's really designed as a knife steel, it seems like if that logic holds true, then the recommended heat treat for a steel like Magna Cut, for example, should be even more legit than something like D2 that's using a much broader base of functions. Does that make sense?
I designed the data sheet for Magna Cut using cross sections that are representative of knives. So, if you trust that more, then the data sheet is much more reliable for heat treating knives. If you trust me less, then you're now suspect of the data sheet.
Right. Okay, that's fair. So begin by making your assessment of Laron's reputability.
That's messed up. If I trust you enough to buy the steel, but I don't trust you enough to go on your heat treat recommendation.
Yeah.
Well, that happens. They think I know what I'm talking about in this area, but once I crossed over into this one, then I'm in unknown territory.
There you go.
Yeah, that's irony.
Everybody's looking for that opportunity to be the special guy who invented his own version of the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, Sean, do you want to try hitting number 4 on our list here?
Well, 4 through 7 are all related.
Uh-oh.
Oh, I'm excited about these.
All right, we'll call this the cryo block. So we'll read them all at once, and then we'll handle them one at a time. How's that sound? Since it's kind of
Sounds good.
inclusive. All right. Insert steel name here, needs or doesn't need cryo, because cryo improves edge retention, or cryo improves toughness. But a freezer doesn't do anything. You need dry ice or liquid nitrogen.
Yeah, these are good ones. So one of the most common things I see written about cryo among knife makers is, you're not heat treating stainless steel correctly unless you're using cryo. So like the steel needs cryo or it's no good. On the flip side, with low alloy steels, 1095, 5200, 01, say, no, that steel doesn't need cryo, or it doesn't benefit from cryo, or cryo has no effect on it, or something along these lines. So all of these are a misunderstanding of what cryo is doing and not doing. So a stainless steel can be heat treated without cryo and be just fine. And the low alloy steels are affected by cryo, and it does change their properties. So I have tested both of these scenarios. So what happens with cryo is we austenitize the steel. We heat it up to high temperature. We convert to austenite. We rapidly quench the steel, either with plate quenching on a high alloy steel or oil quenching, water quenching, whatever it is. We rapidly cool the steel and we form our hard phase martensite. Martensite forms based on temperature. It's not a hold time thing. It's almost entirely temperature. So we've got a martensite start temperature and a martensite finish temperature. And so if we reach the martensite finish temperature, then we have no more austenite remaining. If we do not reach the martensite finish temperature, then we have some austenite remaining. It's called retained austenite.
Yeah.
And virtually any knife steel, because it's so high in carbon, can be heat treated so that martensite finish is lower than room temperature. And so if we continue to cool down, we can convert more of the austenite to martensite. And so that's another one of the myths where we can start, is that stainless steel has a much lower martensite finish temperature than a low alloy steel. It can, because chromium does reduce martensite finish. But the number one element for reducing martensite finish is carbon. And these high carbon steels have a lot of carbon that goes into solution, more than the stainless steels even. And especially if you over-austenitize, overheat the steel with a 1095, you'll get a lot of retained austenite. And you can convert some of that through tempering, but not all of it. And so my dad and I did an experiment with 52100 where we tested the toughness with and without cryo. And we got between half and 1 point increase after a 400-degree temper by using cryo with 52100. So a low alloy steel is affected by it. Now, when it comes to a stainless steel or a high alloy steel, the most important thing you want to do is not over-austenitize. So if you can do this yourself. You take a bunch of coupons of steel and you austenitize them in like 25 or 50-degree increments, and you quench each one, and you measure the hardness on them. And you'll reach a temperature, which is your peak hardness, and going beyond that temperature, the hardness is now decreasing. And that's because you're getting too much retained austenite. And when you go beyond that point where your hardness is going down, you're getting so much retained austenite that your strength also goes down. So even if you tempered two pieces of steel to the same hardness, but one had too much retained austenite, it's going to behave like it's softer. So they both tested at 60 Rockwell C, but the one with too much retained austenite will deform more easily because it has a lower, what's called yield strength. So that is probably too hard to explain right now. But there's yield strength and ultimate strength. Yield strength is the stress at which it starts to deform. The ultimate strength is where it breaks. And hardness correlates better with ultimate strength than yield strength. And so you can be getting the same hardness, but have lower yield strength because you have too much retained austenite. So I'm using a lot of words, but you cannot austenitize the stainless steel or high alloy steel past that peak hardness, because that means you have too much retained austenite. And as long as you do that, you don't need to have cryo. Now, your maximum potential hardness is going to be lower. You can get a couple extra points with cryo, but if that hardness level is acceptable, then you don't need to use cryo.
Okay.
Interesting.
So when you talk about low alloy steel and the benefits of cryo, because the transition from austenite to martensite happens, the bottom of that transition is at a temp below room temp. Mm-hmm. It's almost, just to put it in simplified terms, it's almost like the cryo process extends the quench, basically. Is that a safe way to think of it, or is it not really like that?
That's exactly what happens.
Okay.
So just, with certain steels, you can, if martensite finishes above room temperature, then, you finish the transformation. But if it's below, you can just extend that cooling down to a lower temperature. Right. Now, the austenite can also stabilize at room temperature. This is going to come up again in the freezer section. So a lot of guys want to check their hardness before and after cryo, and you need to stop. You cannot do that. It doesn't matter what the hardness is before the cryo. It does not matter. It's all part of a single quench. And so you wouldn't stop quenching the steel at 400 degrees and be like, I need to know what the hardness is at 400 degrees. No, you wouldn't think in those terms. So you don't want the austenite to start stabilizing. You want to just get it straight into the cryo.
Right. It's really part of one long process, not steps. People think about it like steps, like, okay, I finished the quench and now I'm going to do stuff and then I'm going to cryo, when in reality that getting to the bottom of the martensite transformation really is a continuum, right?
Yeah. And so a lot of data sheets, the evil industry, they recommend doing what's called a snap temper before cryo, or doing your first temper and then doing cryo. The reason why they recommend that is because it reduces your chances of cracking or warping during cryo, but it also stabilizes austenite and makes your cryo less effective. So
okay.
I do not recommend doing the snap temper.
Okay. All right. So that's really the first part of this, right? That the steel needs or doesn't need cryo. And the answer is it depends on what you're trying to do, and it may or may not benefit in a significant way, depending on the steel.
Yeah. And in some cases, it's good to reduce retained austenite as low as possible. That gives you maximum strength, maximum hardness, though a little bit of retained austenite can actually boost your toughness, which we'll get to in number 6.
Okay.
Ooh.
So edge retention, cryo and edge retention.
Yeah, so this one is both true and not true. So the myth is cryo improves edge retention. It can improve edge retention to the extent that you increase your hardness. So you increase your hardness by a point or two, and you get the increase in edge retention that comes from that. However, there are hundreds of papers out there from metallurgists or the cryo industry showing an improvement in wear resistance beyond the increase in hardness. And I simply do not believe those papers. I did an analysis of like 20 or 30 of them in an article I did on cryo, and half of the articles found no improvement, and the other half found a small improvement, which I think is just within the scatter of the tests they were doing. And then there were a couple that did find a reduction in wear resistance. So I think on balance, the most likely result is simply that there was no improvement. But there is more of a drive to report positive results than negative results, if you know what I mean. So when they find an improvement in wear resistance, they publish it. When they don't, it doesn't get published. And they have fancy explanations that nobody but metallurgists would understand for why that improvement in wear resistance was found. But you can come up with a fancy explanation for a lot of things that aren't true.
Right.
And I did an edge retention test on D2 where I took one of the most famous papers on an extended cryo, which was claimed to lead to an improvement in wear resistance on D2. And then I compared that to a D2 knife, which had no cryo. And the one that had cryo on it actually had slightly less edge retention. The reason is because I tried to temper it a little more to get down to the same hardness, to control for hardness, and I ended up going a half a point in Rockwell too far. And so, it had lower edge retention than the knife that had no cryo. So if you control for hardness, there's no improvement in edge retention from cryo.
Okay. Very interesting. I had this experience like 15 or 20 years ago in the car industry. We were working on a project and we were having some challenges with a part, and somehow cryo came up, and I think it was new to me at the time. And so we had somebody from a cryo company come in, and it was wild. It was like straight up snake oil salesman kind of thing. I'm like, yeah, okay. Why is this going to make my part better? And they're like, it makes everything better. Like, yeah, okay. You lost me at everything better. I might need to lead you out now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There wasn't like great real explanations for some of the stuff that they were claiming. So I don't know if it's as much of a snake oil sounding thing today as it once was, but there were people pitching cryo all the things. You know what I mean?
Well, and metallurgists seem to be afraid to speak out against it. So there's a book from 2015 on tool steels from a big time metallurgist, and in there he says cryo is used for reducing retained austenite, and then he has like a one-liner that says there are claims of other performance improvements, but they have not borne out in industrial tests or something, and that's all he says on it. So I mean, there's not big exposés from metallurgists trying to say that it's all baloney. They're not really out there. So the guys that are believers continue to publish papers on it, or people that don't know how to do good studies keep publishing papers. And
right.
So it's just it's self-sustaining. So
yeah. Well, like we talked before, some of the stuff's sort of self-fulfilling, right? If you look in the right place, you can make it look however you want.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm kind of surprised there wasn't a cryo logo in the mid 2000s too.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point.
Man, it was big.
Yeah, interesting. All right, so the next one that was on the set that Sean rattled off was cryo improves toughness.
Yeah, this one is a simple one because cryo almost always decreases toughness. So a little bit of retained austenite can improve your toughness. So if you have too much, you're definitely getting a decrease in your yield strength. But if you have the right amount, it actually improves your toughness a little bit. And this is stated in data sheets and tool steel books and papers and things. You'll probably find it if you read enough D2 papers where they'll say, this austenitizing temperature is selected to get about 15% retained austenite, which they found to be optimal for a combination of toughness and strength. So, I mean, you can definitely go overboard, but cryo is unlikely to improve your toughness. Also, in that 52100 study I was talking about earlier, the cryo 52100 across the board had reduced toughness, and even if you control for hardness. So it's a little bit of a tough question as to whether cryo is something you should do. I do cryo on almost everything that I heat treat just because I think having 10% higher strength is probably better than having 10% higher toughness. Okay. And I want to make sure I don't have retained austenite. But yeah, the potential benefits are being oversold in some cases. And for certain steels, I would recommend it almost universally. So Vanax and LC200N, they're stainless steels with really high corrosion resistance. They get that way by having a lot of chromium in solution, which again reduces our martensite finish that we were talking about. And for those steels, they top out around 60 to 61 Rockwell, and that's with cryo. So if you are not using cryo, then you top out at like 59 or 58, 59 maybe. Okay. And so, yeah, that is part of where the myth comes from that you need to use it for stainless steels, because some of those steels will top out at 61, 62 without cryo, and then you're tempering back to 59 or so, and you might want a little more hardness than that.
Okay. And then the last one, a freezer doesn't do anything. You need dry ice or liquid nitrogen.
Yeah, this is another one I've been raked over the coals for some reason. They see it as an easy one to point out my misunderstanding of science.
It's a good thing you don't consider yourself a man of science, Laron.
I'm going to stop complaining about my trolls in this podcast.
Any minute now.
But yeah, we were talking about the martensite finish. The colder you go, the more transformation you get in martensite. If you go into a freezer, you'll get some more transformation. And I tested this myself with ABL. I did it with one or two others. ABL was the big one that I did, where I did room temperature quenching. I did my household freezer, just a normal temperature, and liquid nitrogen. And the freezer was actually right in between the room temperature quench and the liquid nitrogen. So, most of the transformation occurs at the higher temperatures. And so dry ice and liquid nitrogen, the results are quite similar to each other, even though the liquid nitrogen is significantly colder. And so a freezer can do some transformation. So I say if you don't have liquid nitrogen or dry ice, just go into the freezer. Get as cold as you can and get more transformation. But the stabilization at room temperature we were talking about is even more important in this context. Because the freezer is not as cold, the stabilization is even more effective at preventing transformation. Because once you've stabilized some austenite, that the new effective martensite finish is now lower after the stabilization. And so your freezer may not do anything.
Ah, okay. Right. So that room temperature stabilization kind of stubs off the transition, or you need a bigger step to be able to get the transition to happen.
Yeah.
Interesting. I could see it now. Birch is going to get in trouble. He's going to go take some freshly quenched blade and stick it in with the ice cream bars and get himself in trouble with the family.
Going to put it on the air conditioner.
So it probably completely makes sense that straight quench, then freezer, then liquid nitrogen, because it's somewhere along that path, right? Or that martensite finish point, right? It probably depends on, for the particular steel and situation you're in, where that finish really is as to how effective the freezer on its own would be.
Yeah, it's going to depend on the steel, its composition, and also your austenitizing temperature.
Yeah. Okay.
Because the higher you heat the steel up, the more carbide you dissolve, the more carbon's in solution, the more alloys in solution, which pushes down your martensite finish. That's why when you start over austenitizing at too high a temperature, you're getting extra retained austenite, because that martensite finish is getting lower and lower.
Yeah. Okay. And the lower the martensite finish goes, the more likely that something like liquid nitrogen would drive more transformation. Those go hand in hand.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
Okay.
The freezer will also transform more in that case, but it's just not going to get you far enough.
Yeah, not as much.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, makes sense. Very cool. Cryo. What a crazy thing. I always remember that guy coming in and pitching cryo to me, and I'm like, dude, he didn't give me a single explanation that's any good.
Dude, 20 years ago, you're right, Mark. It was like snake oil.
Yeah. Well, it's
and
like...
it did make everything better, from rifle barrels to knives to car parts.
Yeah, to bearings. Yeah, right? Everything. Yeah. It's like, hey, I'm looking for I want to improve the performance of this bearing. Oh, yeah. Well, hey, look, we cryoed this golf ball. It's like, dude.
I would like to hit a
same.
ball that's frozen.
I'm like, why am I talking to you?
Well, and outside of the journal articles, which, are somewhat reputable, there's advertising materials where they just claim, 10 times, 100 times more wear resistance on steel or something, totally outlandish claims. And obviously those are not true.
Yeah. All right. So the next one on the list, Laron, was simple steels are easier, air quotes, to heat treat.
Yeah. So this is one that has some truth to it. If you want to heat treat a steel in a forge with no temperature control or with a torch, then a simple steel is easier. Like if your goal is to get it hard at the end, it's easier with those steels. But a complex steel is so easy to heat treat. You look at your data sheet, it says hold it at 1850 for 30 minutes. You stick it in your furnace at 1850 for 30 minutes. You take it out and you cool it in air, and it is now hardened. You temper it at 400 degrees, and it's ready to go. There's nothing easier. If you have a controlled furnace, a high alloy steel is the easiest thing in the world to heat treat. It almost doesn't matter how you cool it down at the end. Now, a plate quench will get you a little faster cooling and help you keep it straight, but even that is not a requirement. Where these simple steels, you got to make sure you quench them fast enough. You have to have a fast enough oil. If you're forging it before, then you've got this whole series of steps like normalizing and annealing and maybe grain refining cycles. It's just way more complexity. And when you've got to deal with how you are annealing it after forging, that can lead to different structures, which then mean your response to hardening is different at the end. Stock removal with a high alloy steel is the easiest way to heat treat, in my opinion. So calling the simple steels easier to heat treat, I think, can be somewhat of a misnomer.
So for clarity or for clarification for the listeners, when you say simple steel and low alloy steel, that's the same kind of steels, right? Whereas you're saying complex steel and high
equivalent terms. Yeah. As I'm using them. So low alloy steel meaning like less than 5% alloy addition. So gotcha. 01, 52100, 1095, 1084, those are all low alloy steels that need very fast quench rates to fully harden. High alloy steels, most of them have 4% or more chromium in them for air hardening, and often molybdenum and other elements.
Good clarification. I heard Tom crying in the corner of the room. Ooh, 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 at the beginning of this one.
Well, yeah, Laron actually helped me. I was having some issues with 1084, and it was kind of crazy. It's, to me, like Laron said, you foil wrap them, you plate quench them, you're done with your like D2 or S35VN, whatever. But these other steels, you got to really be on your game to get them in the oil in a timely manner and have the right oil. And actually, I think, Laron, you're doing some testing with different quench oils right now, right?
Yeah, that was my first big YouTube video. So I tested 6 different oils, including canola, which is a common one among bladesmiths that don't want to pay for a real quenching oil. I also quenched into water, and there were a lot of surprises in that study. So, even 1/8 inch 1095 could not harden in canola, which was pretty shocking to me.
Huh.
And
you could make a mean stir fry, but the quench, not so much.
Yeah, though I can't get into all the details here. You'll have to watch the video. But
okay.
Yeah, there were definitely some surprises to me.
Interesting. So you mentioned YouTube. You're doing that now. How do people find you on YouTube? Like if they want to go look at this quench oil study or quench medium study.
Yeah, my channel is called Knife Steel Nerds. I forget what that link is on YouTube, but you can search it pretty easily.
Okay. So, Tom, you were thinking that you'd have a pretty straightforward deal with some 1084, and it wasn't exactly as straightforward as you thought, or maybe just a different thing than what you're used to.
Once again, I was listening to a lot of the common stuff that needs to be done, and I think I was trying to treat it like it'd been forged, because you hear so much about, cycling it and all this different stuff, and if you're not forging it, that's not really necessary. Sorry about the train.
The train's like a member of the show.
Yeah. So, yeah, I reached out to Laron, and he basically walked me through a lot of different stuff, and I'm able to heat treat 1084, 1095. I bought the proper quench oil and all that kind of stuff, and I'm set up where I can do that stuff now.
Which was not canola, for the record.
No. I'm pretty sure I got Parks 50. I can't remember though.
Okay. Yeah, Parks 50 is my favorite.
Yeah, I had Brownells, and I poured all that out and got Parks 50.
Did the Brownells similar to like AAA?
I can't remember. It wasn't quite as fast as Parks, I don't think.
No, I know it's not as fast. That was another weird thing back in the day with forum times, was just all what you could quench in except for the stuff that's made for the steels, which I never quite understood.
Yeah.
I know Parks was hard to get there for a while, but
it's easy now.
Still. Yeah, anymore.
Yeah, and I tried a bunch of different crap that, like, to keep it from getting oxide. I bought this slurry that you mix and dip it in, and if I actually used that, I couldn't get any hardness. It wouldn't quench. So, I mean, a lot of people are recommending that, and that was total crap. Waste of a couple $100 bucks.
Never used. I mean, I've bought them, but never had any luck. I just, I have a surface grinder. Quench, surface grind it off.
Well, if you do it at the proper temperature and hold it for the proper amount of time, I'm not getting really any decarb to speak of. A little bit, but nothing I can't take off with a 400 grit belt.
Yeah. I got the clay and all the growtiness and clean it up.
Right. I'm just trying to get it hard, not make the kick-ass hormones like you do. So
fancy man.
But yeah.
All right, Tom, you want to ask our next question?
Sure. Actually, I think Birch should ask this question.
Yeah, Birch likes this one.
Yeah, this one's up for Birch.
This
number
one.
9.
The steel becomes non-magnetic at the Curie point.
Oh yeah, this is a good one. So there's 2 different ways that steel becomes non-magnetic, primarily. So one is reaching the Curie point. So if you have iron, it's present in a phase called ferrite, which is just the way that the iron atoms are arranged in the iron. If you heat it up past 1,420 degrees Fahrenheit approximately, it reaches what's called the Curie point, where the steel does not transform, or the iron does not transform. It's still ferrite, but it's now non-magnetic ferrite. That's one way that it can become non-magnetic. The other way is if you transform the steel to austenite. So austenitic steel is non-magnetic. So you know this if you have a stainless steel sink, because it's probably non-magnetic. Or certain stainless steel pans or silverware, they're made of austenitic stainless steel. And so they are non-magnetic. And so with high carbon steels, we generally reach austenite before we get to the Curie point. So again, this is one of those cases where knife makers want to look smart, and they learned about the Curie point, and so they always talk about the transition to non-magnetic as the Curie point, but it's probably not the Curie point. It's probably just transforming to austenite. And so this can be important when it comes to at what temperature you're actually transforming and at what temperature you are at when your steel is no longer magnetic. So this is all relevant to trying to heat treat without proper temperature control.
Yeah.
What was your background with this, Michael? You had interest in this one.
I just hear it all the time, and you see people heat treating and using it to try to stick to their blade to see when it's going to do something, and then the blade is pulling heat from the edge or whatever they're touching it to. And we have parameters, we have science, use numbers and digits, not old technology. I don't quite get it. Even if we are using the quote unquote simple steels and heat treating them, there's numbers and stuff we can use, technology. I don't see why we don't use them.
Yeah, and I recently bought a forge. I've always preached about heat treating in a furnace. Get repeatable results, set your furnace to your temperature and put it in there and hold it for the same time every time, and you're going to get identical performance every time. But I'm going to try to prove myself wrong. I'm going to try to use the forge and a magnet and see if I can make it happen. I've got some ideas about how to make it work better. We'll see if it's effective. So I'm going to try to prove myself wrong. We'll see.
What kind of forge did you do?
I bought an Atlas forge. It's a really small forge. It's relatively inexpensive, and so yeah. We'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Are you going to put a stainless steel tube in it to kind of create the less hot points, or?
Yeah, I am not. For one thing, the forge is just too small to try that, but that is a common method, and that will probably be one of the first criticisms on the video or article that I put out, is that I didn't use one. But I mean, it's not required.
Yeah, I don't use one. I built a kind of an atmospheric, so it's coming in from the bottom and kind of going all the way top, and I have temperature on both sides, and I keep my blade at the top, and it stays pretty. I mean, once it stabilizes, it can stay pretty within 10 degrees. Pretty stable. It's interesting.
Yeah, Laron's predicting what the haters are going to say.
Yeah, I caught that
Oh,
one.
I'm sure it's going to be fun. You're going to have some interesting comments.
Tell Laron he's wrong at knifesteelnerds.com. It's going to be a full inbox.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Yeah. We'll look forward to seeing what you come up with. If you're able to prove yourself wrong, that would be pretty cool.
Did you get a thermocouple
Absolutely.
with your Atlas Forge?
I did.
Oh, good. So that's one thing they can't complain about.
They'll find something. Don't worry.
The fact that he knows what temperature it really is. Come on.
Nice.
All right, Tom, you want to take the next one then?
Sure. Let's see. 10. Proper normalizing or grain refining is a secret to high performance.
Man, this is a really good list.
Yeah, whoever came up with this is
Right.
really good at this.
So among forging bladesmiths, they talk about normalizing and grain refining probably more than any other heat treatment step. And it is not the most important step. The most important step is really the austenitizing temperature and soak. If you get that right, a lot of things are going to go right for you. The normalizing and grain refining is really overblown in terms of what it can do for you. So I did an experiment that I presented at Blade Show where I took 1084 and I heat treated it as is from the manufacturer. I heated up to 1475 for 10 minutes and quenched it in Parks 50 and tempered at 400 and tested the toughness. Then I took 2 other pieces of steel. Both of them I overheated at 2100 degrees Fahrenheit for an hour to simulate the grain being blown up during forging. One of those blown up grain samples, I annealed it. I only annealed it. I did no normalizing and no grain refining. The other one, I normalized and grain refined and then annealed. And the toughness between those 2 samples, both of them had blown up grain. One was annealed, one was grain refined and annealed. They had identical hardness and identical toughness. So the anneal did all of the work that I need. It got the structure to where it should be prior to the austenitize. Also, the manufacturer condition, it was a point softer and slightly tougher than either one, whether it was grain refined or not. And that's just because when they come from the steel company, they do a pretty heavy anneal to make sure it's at maximum softness. And that's not necessarily bad, but it's going to respond a little bit differently in heat treatment. So normalizing grain refining, not the secret to success.
What about, Laron, the stress induced from forging? Is there anything there that the normalizing or grain refining would help?
Well, I do recommend a normalize. So in this case, I was not doing any forging, but forging can lead to an inconsistent microstructure. Like the carbide distribution can be off based on where you were forging it. And what temperatures different parts of the steel was seeing. So when I say it's not the secret to high performance, I'm not recommending you skip the normalize. There's a reason why the normalize is there. But it's not going to give you the ultra performance. It's just a good step to perform to get a more even microstructure.
Is there any benefit in doing it multiple times? Because often I've heard that, the secret is I've normalized or whatever, thermal cycled it, 5 or 10 times.
Yeah, and that's where I'm not seeing a clear improvement. When I annealed the 1084 versus normalized and grain refined, there was no difference in the final performance. Now, there may be certain cases where extra cycling can be beneficial, but I have not seen them, and I have a good example of where the performance was identical.
That's one of those that I wonder if it goes back to bladesmiths using their forge to heat treat versus using a heat treat oven, because I think it kind of goes back to how folks were scared to leave it in too long, so they would normalize by putting it in, getting it up to heat, pulling it out, letting go of the black, put it in again, in that same way of like, I don't want it to overheat, that quote-unquote scariness. So I think some of that may have come from that. Do you think that's possible, or?
There's definitely been an evolution on what knife makers recommend to each other on normalizing and grain refining cycles. It's changed a lot over the years. And so the stories have changed and what the benefit has changed. And there's an image that floats around the internet where they show fracture grain. They break apart the piece of steel and show how coarse the grain structure is. And then they have, overheated, then 1-time cycle, 2-time cycle, 3-time cycle, and it gets finer. But I don't actually know how those were generated, because when I did the same thing, like I said, if I annealed before I did the final hardening and quench, the grain was silky smooth. Either way I did it. Now with fracture grain, it needs to be brittle. You can't break it after air cooling. If you heat it up to normalize and then air cool and then break it, you're not seeing the fracture grain, because you have ductile fracture instead of brittle. It has to be a brittle fracture to show the right appearance, to be representative of the grain size. So maybe they're doing something like that they're breaking it from the air cooled condition, or maybe it's just fabricated. I'm really not sure.
Yeah.
Huh.
That reminds me of another myth. The edge packing that
I was going to say
bladesmiths.
this is a good spot for it.
Yeah, edge packing is an old myth that if you heat treat the edge, or not heat treat, forge the edge of the knife at low temperatures at the end, that you will increase the density of the steel. You'll pack things close together. This is a pretty old myth, and I think in most ABS circles these days, they're preaching against it. But it still comes up every once in a while. But it's well known you can't change the density of steel just by hammering it.
Couldn't that put fractures in it also?
Yes, you can fracture steel by forging from too low. I should mention, though, you can decrease density of steel. So this is well known with cold forging. As you cold forge, you increase what's called the dislocation density, which I cannot give a good example, or I can't give a good explanation of that in 2 minutes. But the density of the steel is slightly decreased through the cold work. So edge packing, if anything, decreases its density, not the other way around.
Wow.
How long do you think that's been around? Because that seems like the one that's, like, to me, the oldest or been around the longest.
The edge packing thing.
Yeah, that goes back to olden times. I don't even know how old it is.
Yeah, I didn't know if that was like folks when they started doing like stock removal, bladesmithing kind of being like, well, this is why this is better because, you're getting more blade per, inch or whatever you're wanting to say there.
Yeah, the stock removal forging battles were really hot in the 80s, especially when there was the Knife Makers Guild versus the ABS. And then the ABS was also promoting Damascus steel at the time. And they had the ABS performance test with bending the knives 90 degrees and things like that. And so, yeah, I think that debate was really hot at the time, but it still exists in different forms today. People that forge knives need to tell themselves that they're improving things. So.
Yeah.
You mean they're not?
Well, in most cases, they're not. I mean, heating up the steel to 2,200 degrees, that's a good way of blowing up the grain. And you can fix it to some extent through proper heat treating after that, but you didn't improve it that way. And when it comes to, like aligning things in terms of the microstructure for forging, most of the time you're not benefiting things when it comes to a knife. So I have some schematic diagrams on my website and the book, like how would the orientation of the microstructure change through forging? And I couldn't come up with a good example of how that would benefit the knife for common, fracture modes.
Yeah. This seems like one of those things where it kind of depends on what the hypothesis is, right? Mm-hmm. If the hypothesis is edge packing, the process of that edge packing, the forging at low temps increases density, okay, that's easy to prove, disprove. There's science that does that, right? Whereas if the hypothesis is you can change the alignment of the structure inside the steel by that cold forging process or by, basically cold working the edge of the blade, there's truth to that, right? It's just for what purpose at the end.
Yeah, and there are specialized forging type processing for specific steels where they find the optimal range of forging and stuff to refine certain microstructure features. And so, it's not that forging can't affect the microstructure or affect the properties, and in some ways improve it, but the way knife makers are forging the knives doesn't do any of that.
Yeah.
So, Laron, a question on the edge packing, and this is something I've heard for a long time, and I don't know if maybe that's where this came from, but it seems like I heard that, like in old days, when a bladesmith would get a new anvil, he'd have the apprentices like tap on the surface of the anvil for days in order to like make it where it would be good. Have you ever heard anything like that?
Mm-hmm.
So that would be something like cold working, which is what I
Right.
was mentioning earlier.
Yeah.
So if
So
you've
it's
got
actually doing the opposite.
Yeah, you're slightly decreasing the density, but that's not why they're doing it. So if you it's just like if you bend a paperclip back and forth, it gets stronger and less ductile until it breaks. The same thing happens if you hammer or deform a piece of steel at room temperature. It will get stronger. It may get too strong eventually and fracture. But yeah, if you take a piece of steel and you send it through a rolling mill several times cold and measure the hardness before and after, the hardness will go up.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's a thing people don't think about is those excellent examples you just gave, Laron, like you bend a paper clip back and forth and then it breaks. Okay, well, it broke because it basically the paperclip got too strong, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not that you bent it back and forth until it got weak. It's that you bent it back and forth and it got too strong. And when it got too strong, then it wanted to yield or snap, I guess, not yield, instead of deforming. So it's sort of the opposite, I think, of what people have in their head sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very interesting. You also have to wonder, Tom, how much of that have the apprentices go bang on the anvil for days is a character building opportunity.
Well, yeah. Or you don't have anything for them to do, so hey, go smash on the anvil.
Maybe, yeah.
They also have to sweep the floor for 3 weeks before they're allowed to hit the anvil.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Right. You got to go wax Mr. Miyagi's car, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That makes me want to drink a Coors Banquet right now. I can see it from here. Okay. Sean, you're up with number 11.
I think we covered number 11.
Oh, yeah, we did.
I mean, we didn't read it, but we did cover it.
We did cover it. Look at that. Do you want to touch that one, Laron? I don't know. Forged knives are better than stock removal knives was the line. You're right. We did talk about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a stock removal knife is just as good as a forged knife.
Can feel the Laron is wrong at knifesteelnerds.com email box blowing up already. Okay. Yep.
You can forward those to me.
I mean, I think they both are awesome knives. I love forged knives. I have a bunch, but I would say with stock removal, the ability to use some of the more high performance red hard steels is definitely a plus in certain areas, not all areas.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've seen both sides of this because my dad is known for making Damascus. He does a lot of forging. But my dad is also actually a stock removal knife maker.
All people who forge are.
Yeah, eventually you do have to grind. But my dad does not forge bevels or anything. He might forge something slightly to shape, but it's almost all stock removal. You know, he prefers a nice flat bar that then gets cut out and ground. So forging has certain advantages. You know, if you're making curved blades, it's much easier if you're forging than trying to cut that out of a big sheet and wasting a bunch of material. If you're doing Damascus, you need to forge it unless you're going to buy it pre-made. It's very popular now to get the rough forged look, you know, to leave your sides to have scale on it, and that look is very popular, and that's much easier to do with forged steel. And forging bladesmiths could use high alloy steels. They can use stainless and tool steels with high alloy content. They're just I don't know. They're too scared.
Well, aren't some of those steels really red hard?
They are, but you can still forge them. I mean, my dad is known for forging stainless Damascus. He has done it day in, day out for years. I mean, the stuff can forge just fine. And the steel is being forged by the steel manufacturer, so it has to be forgeable.
Was it Williams that did the D2 knives that were forged?
I'm not sure about that. But D2's been around long enough, I would not be surprised if some guys were forging it.
Man, I remember seeing a forged S30 blade at one point.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
it was
very
like a
possible
one-off.
to do.
Some dude did, but yeah.
There are a couple problems. One is that a lot of forging bladesmiths, they think because it's stainless or because it's a tool steel, that they got to heat it up hotter. But it's going to break. steel becomes less ductile if you heat it up too hot. So for one thing, your microstructure will blow up, both the grain size and the carbide size, and make the steel more brittle. And also eventually the grain boundaries will start to melt. So it looks solid, but it will come apart very easily. So I think that scares away some of them. And it is more difficult to move under the hammer, and they don't like that, of course.
Right.
I've heard that you kind of need a little bit more, it takes a little bit more press power if you're using presses for some of the stainless. And then some of it gets a little more buttery at different temperatures, and that tends to make stuff shift and move a little bit more than, using your carbon steels and whatnot. I don't know how much that is true or not true.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be more difficult. It'll take higher forces to forge it. So, but I mean, stock removal guys are constantly fighting against higher alloy steels that use more belts and more work to do. But the forging bladesmiths have really avoided the moving to harder to work with steels. Instead, they claim benefits to forging for high performance. And so they're saving themselves a lot of time and money. So maybe they're the smart ones.
Right. This feels like a challenge we should issue to Nick Rossi.
Mm-hmm.
Just go forge some S35 or something.
He told me he was going to forge some magna cut. The initial steel he got was too thin for forging, he said, but he's game, he told me.
All right.
Should have forged it thicker.
Sorry, your skill set didn't allow that, Nick.
Yeah, sorry. Forge better.
Too funny. All right. Interesting stuff. What's Sean, you want to hit number 12?
Yeah, sure. A file is a good way to check hardness.
Yeah, so the typical way a file is used, it's generally with simple steels where they're using a forge heat treatment or an uncontrolled temperature heat treatment just to see, did the steel get hard? Because with these poorly done heat treatments or uncontrolled heat treatments, they're not austenitizing to the right temperature. They're quenching in oil that's not really well suited to the application. So especially with beginner bladesmiths, they've got like a 50-50 chance of it even coming out hard. So checking it with a file is one thing that they do early on when they're learning how to heat treat. Because the files are like in the low to mid 60s Rockwell. And so if your steel fully hardened and got up to 65, 66, then the file won't bite into it. But one of the most common questions on the Facebook groups and the forums is that they checked with the file and it was biting in really bad. And if you ask them, did you grind away the decarb in the scale first, the answer is always no. And if they grind away that, then the file will then skate on the steel. So a file is not a foolproof method even to check if you got it fully hard. And then, of course, you can't use the file to see, are you tempering down to the hardness that you want. So ideally, you want to check with a Rockwell hardness tester, of course.
Right. It seems like there's a number of these that we've gone through so far, and maybe a few even that are left, that are in that area of knife making where it's people that don't have great equipment yet, right? Someone who doesn't have a proper heat treat furnace, doesn't have a Rockwell tester. You know what I mean? They're sort of like, I don't know what you want to call it, backyard kind of methods that
half-assed. Does half-assed work there?
No need to dance around it, Sean.
Well, that ain't my bag, baby.
But it sounds like a lot of these are kind of based in that situation, right? I mean, it's sort of like, what's the right way to do it? Okay, there's tools and equipment and whatever to do it the right way. And then there's the reality, right, where people are trying to do this stuff with much more simple equipment or situations, and well,
it's not
some of these things.
It's not inexpensive to do it the right way,
right?
And so that's why I think we see so many kind of workarounds that kind of maybe don't work, as well.
Yeah. It's not just beginners that will argue for these either. I mean, there are people that will swear up and down that a lot of these things are just fine to do. But I recommend sending out for heat treating until you can do it right. Just why are you wasting all your time not even knowing if you're doing it correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Mark hit it on the head a little bit. Like, I think people start out doing that because of lack of money and things like that. But then the trap you fall into, I think, is like, they'll be like, well, this has been working. The knives are selling. Why change it? You know?
Yeah.
But that Rockwell harness tester is only like $650. You know, it's these things aren't that bad. If you're building a base and putting a bunch of knives out there, why not want it to be better? Why not go for, you know, as much knife as you can put into it? I don't know.
Yeah.
Right. And that was kind of my philosophy why I sent stuff out for so long. To do it right is a significant amount of resources of time and money. I mean, honestly, time is just as valuable. And so I would question if what your recommendation is, Laron, and I think I know the answer, and it was kind of my philosophy. If you don't have a Rockwell tester, should you really be heat treating? Can you just go by the numbers and it's good enough?
You shouldn't rely on the numbers in the data sheet because your furnace might be a little off. There might be variation between steel batches.
Ambient temperature.
You might be doing a step incorrectly. You know, you're not quenching fast enough, or whatever it is. You're under soaking, and you're not knowing that because you're not checking the hardness. Now, you may have a local knife maker or a local machine shop or a local weld shop that'll let you check some coupons or a knife. You know, so I recommend when you get a new steel, making those coupons in 25 or 50 degree increments I was talking about before. And, you know, just finding your hardness versus temperature curve. And that gives you a lot more confidence in what you're doing. So you can do it without a hardness tester, but you need to find a friend that will check some steel for you that you've heat treated. But yeah, my philosophy is until you can do it correctly, at least if you have a furnace, you have 90% of what you need. If you can't afford a furnace, then I recommend sending out to professional heat treating services.
Yeah. It seems like good advice. I mean, the hardness check is really like a quality control thing, right? I mean, ultimately, it's making sure that what you think you're doing is actually what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it wouldn't be without risk. It wouldn't be without risk even to have a situation where, while I'm using the same steel and I'm following the same recipe every time, and last time I checked it 6 months ago, it was good, but I don't know, sometimes stuff changes, right? Batches of steel shouldn't be different, but they are, and things happen.
Yeah, your quench oil's going bad, or your furnace starts to drift off, or different things can happen.
Absolutely. Good one. Okay. The next one, I think we talked about this a little bit last time when you were on with us. This one is lower hardness means the knife is more flexible.
Okay. Well, if we addressed it last time, we'll not go too deep into it. But if we're talking about flexing a knife, meaning we flexed it and we let go and it went back to straight, that is not controlled by hardness or strength of the steel. When you're flexing steel, you're literally stretching the iron bonds. So those bonds between the iron atoms are what you're flexing. You can think of them as little springs in between the atoms. And if you heat treat the steel super hard or you leave it annealed, that flexibility will be the same. The thing that makes the steel harder or easier to flex is the geometry. So, you know, this is easy to imagine. If you've got a really thin piece of steel, you can bend it really easy. If you've got a heavy, you know, inch-thick piece of steel, you're not going to be able to bend it. This is, you know, pretty basic. Now, where things change is when you're reaching the yield point. So we were talking about yield stress earlier. When you bend it and it doesn't return all the way true, that means you exceeded the yield strength. And once you've exceeded the yield strength, it doesn't require much more force to keep going. And so if you've got a soft piece of steel, once you've reached that point where it's starting to permanently bend, then you can just keep going and keep bending it. If you've got a hardened piece of steel that is ductile enough not to immediately fracture, it'll keep getting harder and harder to bend because, you know, you're trying to flex it really far and you're not yielding it. And so the force required to keep moving the steel is going to keep going up. So that is where things become different. And so that's why when you're doing an ABS test and bending 90 degrees, it is easier to bend, but only once you've reached the yield point. But you can take an annealed piece of steel and a 65 Rockwell piece of steel and weight it down with the same weight. Clamp it to a table and put weights on it, and it will bend by the same degree as long as you're not exceeding the yield stress. But this is common. Guys will say that they need to temper down the steel to make it more flexible, and it doesn't do that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting thing. I think maybe we didn't talk about this exact thing last time, but that whole dance between hardness, toughness, flexibility, right? They're all different terms for a reason because they're really describing different things. And I think a lot of times people attribute a characteristic to the wrong word, you know what I mean? Or map it to the wrong word, and that ends up causing confusion.
Yeah, where this becomes challenging is if you're trying to make a fillet knife that can bend 90 degrees, the first thing you do is just make it thin, because that'll be easier to flex. Also, the stress that the steel sees is lower for the same degree of flexing if it's thinner.
Right.
That's explained better in my book. So those are the two big things. But the steel needs to be hard enough where you're not exceeding the yield stress. So you can keep dialing back the hardness more and more, trying to give it more quote-unquote flexibility, but eventually you're just going to end up with bent steel when you're trying to demonstrate to the customers that it can bend 90 degrees.
Right. Right. Because your yield strength comes down far enough that flexing it exceeds the yield strength, then boom, bent knife. Yeah.
Now, would the same information work for like folder springs, like slip joints?
Yeah, you can go too soft and you'll be deforming your springs. Now, when steel gets harder, it can also become less ductile, where it won't even reach its yield stress. It will prematurely fracture. So what people are doing when they're tempering back things like springs is they are improving the ductility of the steel, because knife steels are very brittle in general terms. So when I design a steel for cars, it is much, much more ductile than a knife steel. And so many knife steels will fracture before they ever reach their yield point. And so you can keep increasing the hardness, but the stress at which the steel fractures will be going down because it never reaches its true strength potential. And so if you temper down, you'll reach this crossover point where it'll be able to reach its yield stress and therefore be able to take more before it will break or bend. So you can see this on, I discussed 3-point bend tests in my book also, where steels all have a peak bend stress. So you go up in hardness and the bend stress or bend strength keeps going up until you go too far and the steel becomes so brittle that your bend strength starts to go down.
Okay. Interesting. I think when you talk about knife steel versus steel for cars, for example, for the auto industry, that I assume is because one is a steel that's going to be used in stamping processes, or that needs to collapse under crash conditions and stuff like that. Are those the kind of differences we're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're stamping out complex parts where it's got to be deformed and shaped in all sorts of ways. And then knife steels have brittle carbides for wear resistance in them. And those are all crack initiation points, which we would want to avoid in a steel that's going to be formed into parts. So just, we're talking about pretty extreme steels, really, when it comes to knife steel. They're very high in hardness and high in wear resistance.
All right. Tom, do you want to hit number 14?
Sure. When the edge deforms, that means the steel is tougher than a steel where it chips.
Okay.
Seems like there's a lot of information not there.
Right. So I see this pretty frequently where people buy a knife made for chopping or a knife with a reputation for high toughness, and the edge will deform in some test. They'll hit some hardwood or twist out of something and the edge deforms. And this is usually given as an example of the steel being designed correctly. This edge deformed, it didn't chip out. That means that this is really tough steel. It can bend like this without fracturing. But again, we keep talking about yield strength. The fact that it deformed means that the knife was not strong enough for the application you were trying to use it for. So it was not strong enough for the application. Now, one that's chipping is also undesirable. But the fact that it deformed is not a positive. That means that you exceeded the knife's capabilities. We did a test. Sean Houston, a knife maker that's worked with me on a few projects, he tested against an SE knife in 1095, which is like 55 or 56 Rockwell, against a knife with identical geometry and magna cut at 62 Rockwell. And the magna cut knife could do much tougher cutting and chopping tasks just because it had higher strength than the 1095 at 56 Rockwell. So in some cases, it can be a good thing that the edge deformed because you really pushed it beyond its limits. But those limits might be higher if you had a little more hardness on it, which perhaps could mean a little bit lower toughness on a true toughness test. But with knives, we need a combination of strength and toughness.
Okay. The next one we already talked about, right?
Yeah.
I was going to send this one Birch's way, but he's got a Blackstone, so he's very familiar with canola oil. He's just not using it to quench.
No.
This one was canola is a good quenching oil, and I think we talked earlier. You concluded that is definitely not the case, right, Laron?
Yeah, I actually thought canola was going to do well. There was some information in the literature that canola cools steel relatively quickly, and it doesn't form a vapor jacket like commercial quenching oils do. The problem is it reaches its peak cooling rate at a really high temperature and then slows down right where we need it to be fast for the steel. It's called the nose of the curve on a time temperature transformation diagram. The nose is the shortest period of time that it takes for the steel to transform, and that'll occur at some temperature like 1200 degrees Fahrenheit or something. And so the canola gets slow right where you want it to still be fast. And so canola did really poorly in my tests. I bought the slowest oil that I could find commercially available. It had a way slower rating than any oil I've ever heard of, and the canola did worse. And canola is faster than some of the other oils. Like I found a paper where they looked at motor oil versus canola, and the motor oil was much slower than the canola. So definitely no motor oil for sure. But even canola was worse than the slowest commercial quenching oil that I could find.
Did you try what was it called? Like Goop or what was Wayne Goddard's? Yeah. What was that called?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, the Goop.
I did. Yeah, it's just called Goop Quench, or Goddard Goop Quench. I did not try the Goop Quench. I did not try Super Quench. So I tried water and I tried several oils, including canola.
Well, wasn't the Goop just any kind of crap he had around?
The Goop was a combination of a bunch of things, including bacon grease, I believe.
Yeah.
I know there was some transmission fluid.
So sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah, Wayne Goddard was a cool guy. He had a big influence on the knife industry, and he was occasionally wrong about things also.
So
aren't we all?
Yeah. Well, and this is
except you, Laron.
This goes back to that thing where, like some of the other examples we talked about, X may be better than Y, but X ain't great either, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe somebody, because you see this a lot, right? At least I do in these beginner bladesmithing kind of areas, right? People are like, yeah, I'm just quenching in motor oil or the oil that I took out of my car when I did my oil change or whatever, right? And okay, canola oil is faster, and it sounds like maybe you concluded that that's true, but it's not, maybe not, still not a great quench medium, right? So
yeah, and you can buy canola, like 5 gallons of it for around $30. So I understand that it's tempting, but you can buy Parks AAA for like $80. So I mean, do you really need to save $50 to have subpar quenching oil?
Not when heat treating is the most important factor for high performance, obviously. Wait. I take that back.
Damn it.
Okay. What, Birch, you want to hit number 16?
Sure. The carbon steels are better than stainless steels, obviously.
Oh, boy.
Wrong.
Yeah, so this is also part of the ABS versus Knife Makers Guild debates, because it was really about 154 440C versus low alloy steels being forged. So like the debates kind of go hand in hand, even though they shouldn't really be related to each other. But there's a bunch of aspects to this one. I mean, for one thing, different steels are different for a reason. They have different combinations of properties. So no one steel is necessarily better than another. One steel might even have worse properties across the board, but if it's cheaper, it has some purpose, some use. But this argument in any way is just too overgeneralized. For one thing, carbon steel is a category that is way too big. So carbon steel really is only supposed to refer to steels that are alloyed with carbon, manganese, and silicon, and that's it. We use the term generically to mean any non-stainless steel a lot of times. But if you're talking a high alloy non-stainless like D2 or some of these powder metallurgy steels, they have more in common with a stainless steel than they do with those low alloy simple carbon steels. The properties and carbide structures and things are quite similar, apart from just not being as corrosion resistant as a stainless steel. And then also there are stainless steels with microstructures that are pretty similar to carbon steel. So an easy example is AEBL or Nitro V or steels in those categories, where they've got very fine carbides. They're relatively easy to grind and finish and sharpen. And if you like carbon steels but you want corrosion resistance, they're a good place to look, because they're just very easy to work with. They have really high toughness and really fine microstructure, just like your favorite simple carbon steels.
Performance-wise, would you say that AEBL and 52100 are pretty similar as far as performance other than the corrosion resistance?
Yeah, except AEBL is better in wear resistance because it has chromium carbides instead of cementite, so iron carbide. So 52100 has chromium alloyed with it, but it still forms iron carbide that's enriched somewhat in chromium, and the chromium carbides are a little bit harder and give the AEBL higher wear resistance. So yeah, if you like 52100, AEBL is a good stainless to use, but AEBL is better in many ways also.
Super easy to heat treat.
Yeah. The big complaint I hear about AEBL and similar steels is that they warp a lot. And that seems to be because they make the steels as a coil and anneal it as a coil, so it wants to return back to its coil roots once you heat treat it. So there's different ways you can try to get around that, including stress relieving or annealing the steel before you do the final heat treatment. Plate quenching helps some. You can do different straightening procedures after quenching. But yeah, I hear it's a pain, so I don't really have to deal with it.
Interesting. Have you had that issue, Tom?
Yeah, and I do. I talked to Laron about it, and I do the anneal and plate quench with AEBL, and they'll come out dead straight, but the problem I found was that when I went to liquid nitrogen, they would just curl up. And so I actually was looking at some of Grace Horn's stuff, and I got the idea. So I actually I'll take a bundle of blades and I wire the hell out of them together. And when I cryo them now, they come out dead nuts straight. So problem solved.
It also depends some on the thickness of the steel, and I don't know. There's a bunch of factors, but
I'm usually using 1/8 inch or less. So, and it when I put that in the liquid nitrogen, I would get over the length of a 6-inch blade, it'd be a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch off where it should be. So it was pretty significant.
Wow, that shape memory thing is interesting.
Yeah, it's weird.
Okay. So, Sean, we're thinking 17. We're sort of dancing on the edge of that question already, right?
Yeah, let's go ahead and roll it out there. Old steels are better than, air quotes, super steels.
Yeah, and then I also included the alternative myth. Super steels are better than old steels, the reverse. So, first of all...
Depends on what you're selling. That's the real answer.
Yeah. So super steels is a loose term. I did a bunch of reading on super steels trying to figure out what do people mean by super steel exactly. It generally means a new-ish steel that has high wear resistance. That's usually the definition of super steel. And some guys will then say, oh, we don't need these new super steels, my 440C, 154CM, VG10, whatever their their steel is they got started with. They say that's just fine. I don't understand these super steels. But using the term super positively and in a negative way goes back as old as I could find the use of the term. I found an article from 1978 where it said people don't want to use these super steels because they're too hard to sharpen instead of the older standby steels. So this was 1978, meaning the super steels they were talking about then were like 440C and 154, which are now the steels that we call old and tried and true now. So the definition of super steel changes over time. It just means new, and to some people that's a negative, and to other people that's a positive. So a super steel being a bad thing goes back to the beginning, as far as I can tell. So again, it's just different steels are different. So there's steels with higher wear resistance. That's good for certain applications, certain users. And for certain users, they need a different set of properties or for a different type of knife. So yeah, it's easy to denigrate something as just being new and not tried and tested, but it's not really a good way of looking at it. We don't say to use something just because it is new or old or whatever.
Yeah. Well, we don't say that, but lots of people do.
Mm-hmm.
It goes back to that thing that I kind of tongue-in-cheek comment about, it depends on what you're selling, but there's a lot of this that falls into that category, right? Where some of these things are perpetuated by people who want to sell what they like making or know how to make or are good at making, right? So sometimes it sounds like there's some invention of reasons why it's better, or maybe exaggeration of why things are better or worse or whatever.
Yeah, and a lot of these arguments don't even necessarily come from knife makers. I mean, a lot of knife makers using older steels, they just prefer using them, or they don't even necessarily care what steel they're using. And then it's the super enthusiasts that are coming up with reasons for why they purchased a certain thing and why they don't want to purchase some other product, and then they'll evangelize to other people.
Evangelize is a great word. I've used that several times myself.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it feels like at times, right? People preaching.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, it looks like the last one on our list is chopping a brick or nail is a useless test of a knife.
Yeah, so this is another good controversial one, because there are knife makers or YouTube guys or whatever that will do some extreme tests on a knife, chop through a cinder block brick or chop through a heavy nail or whatever it is. And there are people that will go on and say, what a waste of time. Like, I'm never going to chop through a cinder block, or I'm never going to be attacked by a cinder block. So why would I test it in that way? And there is some truth to that. I mean, the number one test you need to do as a knife maker is just use it with the intended use. If it's a kitchen knife, then go in the kitchen and cut a bunch of things and make sure it makes it through all of those tests unscathed. However, there is something to be said for testing a knife to failure. If you test knife A and it cuts through a tomato and you chopped up your salsa and it's fine at the end, and then you do the same test with knife B and it also makes it through the test, then how do you know which one was better? Or how do you know if your new steel you're trying out did better than the old one? How do you know if your new heat treatment procedure did better than the old one? How do you know if your new sharpening method did better than the old one? If you're testing for toughness, you have to break something to know if you've made an improvement. So we do this all the time as metallurgists. We break every piece of steel that we test because you don't know what its limits are until it's broken. So you need to do some type of extreme testing to force something to fail to make a comparison. So once you have something that failed and something that didn't in the same test is when you know that there's an improvement. And so chopping through a brick, maybe that's a way of doing that.
Yep.
I can remember once somebody online did something with one of my knives, and it kind of pissed me off, honestly. They took another knife, and I'm not going to say that the brand, but they put another knife and my knife edge to edge like a cross, and they tried to pound them through each other.
Mm.
And I'm like, what is the ever loving? Why would you do that? There's nothing you'll prove. At least I didn't think there would be. I mean, it just destroyed my knife.
Yeah, that one is a strange one because one or both of the knives will fail.
Right.
Well, mine
sometimes
failed.
Sometimes it's just, a lot of times it's just both of them. Because you're taking a very hard, thin piece of steel and then driving it into the other one and vice versa. So that one is a strange one because it's hard to control for things with that because, whatever you're testing all these different types of knives, different edge geometries, different hardness and toughness levels, and then just pounding them into each other. But so the geometry of the piece that you're pounding into the other one is different in every test that you do.
Yeah.
So there's not really much of a control in that case.
Yeah.
So it's more of a gladiator battle than a test.
Well, if you're gonna pound a knife into mine, you probably don't want my knife. I'll just put it out there.
Tom's pushing away customer base right now.
Jeez.
Well, and I prefer thin slicing knives. That's what I like. But as a knife maker, nothing gives you more confidence in your knife than putting it through an extreme torture test and it comes out fine at the end. You're like, wow, I have this super thin geometry, really high hardness, and this high wear resistance steel, and it handled chopping through this nail. So sometimes you can push geometry even thinner than you think, and chopping through the nail is a good way to see, like, wow, this can go thinner than I thought I could.
Well, nails are relatively soft, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, that edge to edge and hammer them together thing is a little like taking two pickup trucks and chaining the hitches together and doing the tug of war thing or something. That's what it feels like to me.
Except it's like both trucks blow up at the end or something.
Well, if you smash two trucks together, but one weighs more than the other one, and one was driving 20 miles an hour faster than the other one, and then you declare a winner based on that. Just none of your variables are controlled.
Demolition derby test. Yeah, that's a better analogy, I guess. Yep. Okay, this is me scribbling on my paper. Don't use Tom's knives for the edge-on-edge battle.
Son.
Got it.
That was my next YouTube video.
Yeah, that was number.
Sorry to ruin all the excitement.
See? And then Tom jumped to question 21.
21? There's not.
It was is the knife gladiator battle a useful test of performance? You didn't have that on your list?
I missed that one.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I didn't see those kind of tests until somewhat recently, maybe a couple of years ago. I'd never heard of that until then. So
that's the miracle of YouTube, Laron.
Mm-hmm.
The miracle of people inventing content.
Right.
Knowing people consume almost anything. It's bizarre. Especially if shit gets ruined in the process. That's the real key. Something's got to get jacked up.
Well, and this brings to mind something I did want to mention at the end of the show. I don't know if today, right now is a good time, is it?
Yeah. I think we're pretty much through the list.
Yeah, I mean, many of us remember Cliff's stamp on blade forums. You bash stuff into concrete blocks and stuff. And, at first he was very controversial. I guess all along it was probably a little bit controversial, but some of his videos early on, kind of turned many of us. But I ended up really enjoying Cliff's stamp, and he pushed me to do some stuff that I wouldn't have done otherwise. And I found out that he passed away in June, and it was unexpected. And he was actually pretty young. He was, I think, younger than me. So my condolences to his family, and I feel like the knife industry has lost one of those minds that questioned everything.
Yeah, he was a very controversial figure. I did a lot of arguing with him when I first got into knives and steel, like as a teenager. And he was eventually banned on blade forums for stirring up too much trouble. But later, I went back and read some of his stuff, and I was like, oh man, I agree with this thing that he's saying.
Right? I found myself doing the same thing.
and some things that I didn't understand or dismiss before, I started to see the sense in it. So, maybe I didn't agree with him about everything, or maybe I didn't agree with his, antagonistic approach when it came to online discussions. But I did send him my book to, before it was ready as one of the editors, and he sent me back some good feedback on the book. So yeah, I think he could have been nicer and more tactful, but he did a lot of testing and he learned a lot of things. So I think he is to be commended for that work that he did.
Well, and some personalities just aren't. They're kind of rough around the edges, and I think he was one of those people. But he was seemed like a pretty. His intentions were in the right place. I'll say.
Yeah, his ultimate goal was truth. So even though his test could be somewhat radical looking, he wasn't trying to do clickbait type tests. He was trying to separate knives in performance. So
yeah, unafraid of controversy to the point of maybe actually enjoying it a little bit, but well intentioned at heart.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think that gets us through the list. Laron, thanks for sending this fantastic list, and then our one question that we kind of wedged in the middle. We talked about your YouTube channel, so people should go find your YouTube channel. You only have one video out for now?
Yeah, I think I have a second video, but it's like 30 seconds long showing the catcher edge retention tester. This was my first real content video.
Okay. Is that something you're planning to do more of, or?
Yeah, I'd like to. I mean, I was on forums until I got tired of that. I started a website because that was a little more permanent and had a place to go. Then I was tired of my website being so big no one could read it all, and so I wrote a book. And then I'm tired of people that don't want to read, and so I want to make them video content. So I'm trying different mediums for different purposes.
Yeah.
Oh, you're out there for the lazy person.
I want it to be as easy as possible to learn about heat treating and metallurgy and steel. My goal is always education, to make things as easy as possible to understand. I went through a PhD engineering education. I experienced a lot of difficult to understand things. So my goal is always to make things as simple as possible. And that doesn't mean making things overly simplified. I just try to use simple language and explain things in ways that people can understand. So that's always my goal, and sometimes I'm more successful than other times.
Yeah. Well, I think you do a good job of that, Laron, of breaking it down to the point of being more understandable without going so far as to change the story along the way, right? That's the tricky balance.
Yeah, and you'll see that in some, science TV shows or podcasts or something where they use analogies that aren't exactly correct. And maybe I could do more of that, but I always feel like if we just simplify things enough, start at the bottom, the most basic explanation, and build on top of it, I think most people can understand even very complex subjects. We don't have to oversimplify things, is my view.
Yeah, I think we, as a society, unfortunately, have gotten so accustomed to this soundbite mentality, right? If you can't give a message in 8 words or less,
yeah,
right? Then that's too complicated. I don't have time for that. So you can't go that far, obviously. But
your podcast is 2 hours. I can't listen to it.
Well, there's different styles for different people. I mean, some people they're in the shop hand sanding blades all day, and what they really want is a 2-hour podcast instead of having to skip between 8-minute episodes of whatever all day long. And other people, they've got a 15-minute commute and they really prefer a 15-minute podcast. So different people will find what they want.
Yep. I think the YouTube thing is interesting. I'll have to go check that out. Look forward to seeing what you put up there.
That'll be good for my commute.
Yeah. Tom's on his little Razor scooter pushing it down the street to the shop.
As I drive to work.
Yeah. Just
kidding. I don't do that.
All right. Well, we mentioned earlier about Laron's Patreon, so you can go find him there. KnifeSteelNerds.com. Is that the website, Laron?
Yep. Yeah. In my most recent YouTube video, I had a corresponding article which had some more details in it. Because, the YouTube video I wanted to keep really tight and flow well to keep people interested. So that's my plan for now, is to do an article with a video. So if you just go to knifesteelnerds.com, that top article will have the YouTube video in it to watch. So for people that want to read, I'm still writing things. And for people that might get into things because it's video, then I hope to deliver more of that. It's very time consuming to do video.
Oh, yeah.
Be sure and grab a t-shirt.
Yeah.
I got one.
Tell folks about the t-shirt.
Yeah, I've got a Knife Steel Nerds logo shirt, and I've also got the CPM Magna Cut t-shirt where it's got a Magna Cut logo on front and our Magna Cut knife grinding man on the back. So those logos were designed by my uncle, Ralph Thomas. He also designed the cover of my book. He did this really cool 60s style newspaper ad for CPM Magna Cut that's really awesome. And the guy grinding the knife came from that ad for the t-shirt. So yeah, that's tpublic.com/user/knifesteelnerds, or you can go to knifesteelnerds.com and click on t-shirts in the menu. So, and then go buy my book. And I wish I don't have any other products to sell. I should have more.
Yeah, you need stuff to sling when you come on here.
Mm-hmm.
I love the logo. Well done, Mr. Ralph Thomas, on the design. It's fantastic for the Magna Cut stuff. I think it's a fantastic concept. The whole thing is just a great logo.
It's fun.
Yeah, it's fun. Exactly.
Yeah, I had looked at a bunch of space age ads from like the 60s and 70s, including some for steels. One of the inspirations for the name Magna Cut was the steel Hypercut, which was one of the first 70 Rockwell steels. And I found this cool ad that literally had, stars on it, because everything was about space in the 60s and 70s. It was space age technology. So yeah, that was some of the inspiration. So I found a bunch of space age ads and sent them to Ralph, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I know exactly what style you're talking about." So that
very
was
cool. Yeah, that's fun. All right. Well, Laron, thanks again for taking the time to chat with us and tune us up and bust some myths and maybe prove some are true. And I will be interested to hear what folks have to say. As always, fantastic information on your website. I think the approach of video with an associated article is a really, really smart plan. If your goal is education, that's a great way to do it. Like you say, you can hook them with video, and then if they want to dive in, then go start reading. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on. I'll come on anytime you guys want.
Well, we'll definitely take you up on that. All right. Well, I think that's it. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We'll talk to you next time. To learn more about our makers, you can find Tom Crine on the web at crineknives.net, in his Facebook group, Crine Knives, or in his Instagram account, @CrineKnives. For Michael Birch, check birchtreeblades.com, Facebook group Birch Tree Blade Works, or Michael's Instagram @BirchTreeBlades. For myself and the Raygun Bead Project, we're on the web at raygundivision.com. We have a Facebook group called Raygun Division, or my personal Instagram @msteiner. For those interested in photos, references from the show, or some discussion about the show itself, you can find us on the web at markofthemaker.com, in a Facebook group called Mark of the Maker, or on our Instagram @markofthemaker. Last but not least, the ultra cool and haunting background music we use for the show is a piece called Noir Guitar by Stevie's Amp Shack, found at the Free Music Archive and licensed under Creative Commons CC BY 4.0. Thanks for listening.